The autumn wind swept through the gardens of Gatcombe Park as Princess Anne stood by her study window, watching the golden leaves dance in the breeze. At 73, she had seen countless royal scandals come and go, but the document in her hands felt different, heavy. The kind of secret that could shake the very foundations of the monarchy she had served her entire life. The envelope had arrived that morning, delivered by a trusted friend who worked in the archives of a London law firm. Inside was a copy of a private agreement signed 25 years ago that detailed arrangements far more complex than the public had ever imagined. Anne's fingers trembled slightly as she read the legal language that spelled out Camilla's carefully orchestrated path to the throne. The agreement outlined how Camilla Parker Bowles would gradually be introduced to royal duties, how public opinion would be slowly shifted in her favor, and most shocking of all, how certain obstacles would be managed along the way. Anne recognized some of the signatures on the document: lawyers, palace officials, even members of parliament. This wasn't just about love conquering all, as the fairy tale had been sold to the public. This was about power, influence, and a decades-long campaign to secure Camilla's position as queen consort. What troubled Anne most wasn't the political maneuvering itself. Royal marriages had always involved strategy and careful planning. What disturbed her was the section labeled contingency plans and the names listed underneath it, names of people who might pose problems to the arrangement. Names that included Diana Spencer, before she had even married Charles. Names that included her own nephew, William, should he ever discover the truth about his stepmother's rise to power. Anne had always prided herself on her direct approach to royal duty. While her brothers had stumbled through scandals and her mother had navigated decades of constitutional crises with careful diplomacy, Anne had built her reputation on hard work and straight talk. She had no patience for games or manipulation. But this document forced her to confront an uncomfortable truth about her own family's inner workings. The Princess Royal walked to her desk and picked up her secure phone, the one connected directly to Clarence House. She needed to speak with Charles, but first, she needed to understand exactly what her brother had known and when he had known it. The implications were staggering. If the press got hold of this information, it wouldn't just be embarrassing. It could potentially destabilize the monarchy at a time when public support was already fragile. As she dialed, Anne thought about William. Her nephew had grown into a thoughtful, dedicated future king, but he had also inherited his mother's sense of justice and her intolerance for deception. Diana had died believing she had been outmaneuvered by Camilla, but even Diana hadn't known the full extent of the planning that had gone into her replacement. William deserved to know the truth, but Anne also understood that the truth could destroy his relationship with his father and stepmother forever. Charles answered on the third ring, his voice warm but slightly distracted. Anne could hear classical music playing in the background, probably one of his evening concerts at Highgrove. For a moment, she hesitated. Once she spoke these words, there would be no going back. The family dynamic would shift permanently. The conversation that followed was unlike any Anne had ever had with her brother. Charles's initial denials quickly gave way to uncomfortable silence as Anne read specific passages from the document. She could hear him breathing heavily on the other end of the line, the classical music now seeming almost mockingly peaceful in the background. Charles finally admitted that yes, there had been discussions about managing Camilla's transition into royal life. Yes, there had been contingency plans, but he insisted that nothing illegal had been done. Nothing that hadn't been done for generations to protect the monarchy's interests. Anne listened to his explanations, but the document told a different story. This hadn't been simple royal protocol. This had been a sophisticated campaign to eliminate obstacles and manufacture public acceptance. When Anne mentioned William's name on the contingency list, Charles's voice changed entirely. He became defensive, almost angry. He accused Anne of misunderstanding the context, of seeing conspiracy where there was only careful planning. But Anne had read the document too carefully to be dismissed so easily. The section about William wasn't about protecting him, it was about managing him if he became a problem. The call ended badly, with Charles hanging up after demanding that Anne destroy the document immediately. But Princess Anne had never been one to follow orders, even from the king. Instead, she made copies. One went into her personal safe, another was prepared for her lawyer, and a third was placed in an envelope addressed to Kensington Palace. Over the next few days, Anne wrestled with her conscience. She had always believed that family loyalty came first, that royal dirty laundry should never be aired in public. But this felt different. This wasn't about protecting family embarrassment. This was about protecting the institution of the monarchy itself from the potential consequences of this secret eventually coming out through other channels. Anne decided she needed advice from someone outside the immediate royal circle, but still trustworthy. She reached out to a former private secretary who had served the late Queen Elizabeth with distinction for over 2 decades. Over lunch at a quiet restaurant in the Cotswolds, Anne shared her dilemma without revealing specific details. The former secretary's response was sobering. In his experience, secrets this significant never stayed buried forever. The digital age had made privacy almost impossible to maintain, and the legal profession's record-keeping meant that documents like this could surface at any time. His advice was clear. Controlled disclosure was better than uncontrolled revelation. Anne returned to Gatcombe Park that evening with a heavy heart, but a clearer sense of purpose. She would tell William, but she would do it carefully, in a way that gave him time to process the information and decide how to respond. She owed that much to Diana's memory and to William's future as king. The next morning, Anne called Kensington Palace and requested a private meeting with William. Her tone was serious enough that his private secretary cleared his schedule immediately. When William asked what the meeting was about, Anne simply said it concerned information he needed to know about his stepmother that could affect his future reign. As she prepared for the journey to London, Anne looked once more at the document that had started this chain of events. The legal language was dry and bureaucratic, but between the lines was a story of ambition, manipulation, and careful orchestration that had reshaped the royal family forever. William deserved to know that story, whatever the consequences might be for the family's future unity. The drive to Kensington Palace gave Anne time to plan exactly how she would present this information. William was intelligent and thoughtful, but he was also protective of his family and conscious of his responsibilities as future king. She would need to be careful not to let her own anger at the deception color how she shared the facts. William deserved to make his own judgments about what the document meant and how to respond to it. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Kensington Palace as William paced nervously in his private study. His aunt's urgent request for a meeting had left him unsettled all night. Princess Anne wasn't given to dramatics or unnecessary family conferences. When she said something was important, it usually was. Catherine noticed his restlessness at breakfast and asked if everything was all right. William kissed her forehead gently and assured her it was probably just routine royal business. But even as he spoke the words, he didn't believe them himself. Anne's voice on the phone had carried an edge he'd rarely heard before, a mixture of determination and reluctance that suggested whatever she wanted to discuss would change things permanently. When Anne arrived, she looked every inch the seasoned royal she was, but William could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she clutched her handbag just a little too tightly. They embraced briefly, and Anne asked if they could speak completely privately. William dismissed his staff and led his aunt to his personal study, closing the door behind them. Anne wasted no time with pleasantries. She placed a manila envelope on William's desk and looked directly into his eyes. What she was about to share, she explained, would be difficult to hear and even more difficult to process. But as the future king, he needed to know the full truth about how his stepmother had secured her position in the royal family. William felt his stomach tighten as Anne began to speak. He had always known that his father's relationship with Camilla was complicated, that their eventual marriage had required careful navigation of public opinion and royal protocol. But as Anne outlined the contents of the document, William realized he had understood almost nothing about the true scope of what had taken place. The strategic planning had begun years before his mother's death, Anne explained. Teams of advisors, lawyers, and public relations experts had developed detailed plans for managing Diana's divorce from Charles, for minimizing her future influence, and for gradually introducing Camilla as a legitimate royal partner. What shocked William most was learning that his own future role had been discussed and planned around, as if he were a chess piece to be moved rather than a person with his own thoughts and feelings. Anne handed him the document, and William read it with growing disbelief. The clinical language described his mother's management during her final years, the careful orchestration of public sympathy for Charles and Camilla, and most painfully, contingency plans for dealing with potential opposition from Diana's sons. The document even outlined strategies for ensuring William's future cooperation as king, including recommendations for limiting his access to certain information about the monarchy's finances and international relationships. William set the papers down and walked to the window, his hands shaking slightly. Below, tourists were gathering outside the palace gates, taking photos and hoping for a glimpse of royal life. They had no idea that inside these walls, the foundations of everything they believed about the modern monarchy were crumbling in real time. Anne watched her nephew process the information and felt her heart break for him. She had known this would be devastating, but seeing William's face as he absorbed the implications was almost unbearable. This wasn't just about discovering that his stepmother's rise to power had been carefully orchestrated. This was about learning that his entire adult life had been shaped by plans made without his knowledge or consent. William turned back to face his aunt, and Anne could see that the young man who had entered the study was gone. In his place stood someone harder, more guarded. The transformation reminded her painfully of how Diana had changed after learning about Charles's continued relationship with Camilla. Some betrayals, Anne realized, altered people at their core. The questions came in a flood. How long had Anne known? Who else was involved? Was his grandmother, the late Queen Elizabeth, aware of these arrangements? Anne answered as honestly as she could, explaining that she had only recently discovered the document herself, that the network of people involved was larger than she had imagined, and that she suspected the Queen had known something, but perhaps not the full extent of the planning. William asked about his brother Harry, and Anne had to admit that Harry's name appeared in the document as well, but in a different context. The planners had apparently viewed Harry as less of a potential threat to their arrangements, perhaps because he was further from the throne, or because his rebellious nature made him easier to dismiss as unreliable. The casual dismissal of Harry in the document's language clearly wounded William, who had always been protective of his younger brother. As the morning progressed, William's shock began to transform into something harder and more focused. He asked Anne for copies of everything and began making notes of his own. He wanted to understand exactly how the current arrangements between the palace and various media outlets had been established. He wanted to know which advisors were still in positions of influence. Most importantly, he wanted to understand how much of his own future role as king had been predetermined by agreements made decades ago. Anne watched her nephew's transformation with mixed feelings. Part of her was proud to see him taking control of the situation, refusing to be a passive victim of other people's schemes. But she also worried about the anger she could see building in him, the way his jaw tightened when he spoke about his father and stepmother, the cold calculation that had replaced his usual warmth when discussing family matters. By lunchtime, William had made several decisions. He would not confront his father or Camilla immediately. Instead, he would conduct his own investigation, using resources available to him as the heir to the throne. He wanted to understand the full scope of what had been done in his name and in the name of the monarchy. Only then would he decide how to respond. Anne offered to help with the investigation, but William declined. This was something he needed to handle himself, he explained. His trust had been fundamentally shaken, and he needed to rebuild it on his own terms. He thanked Anne for bringing the information to him, acknowledging that it must have been difficult for her to essentially betray family confidences. As Anne prepared to leave, William made one final request. He asked her to say nothing to anyone about their conversation, at least for now. He needed time to process what he had learned and to develop a plan for moving forward. Anne agreed, but she could see that the isolation William was choosing might be as damaging as the betrayal itself. That evening, William sat alone in his study long after Catherine and the children had gone to bed. The document lay spread across his desk, its pages now familiar from multiple readings. Each time he reviewed the plans for managing his mother's legacy, for controlling his own future authority, for ensuring Camilla's acceptance, he felt the anger build stronger. But beneath the anger was something worse, a profound sense of loneliness. The document made clear that the people he had trusted most had been planning around him rather than with him for his entire adult life. His father, who had taught him about duty and service, had been managing him like a public relations problem. His stepmother, whom he had gradually learned to accept and even appreciate, had been following a script designed decades ago. William opened his laptop and began researching the law firm whose letterhead appeared on the document. He wanted to know who else they represented, what other royal arrangements they had facilitated, and whether there were additional documents that might shed light on other aspects of his family's private dealings. As he worked through the night, William began to understand that what Anne had shown him was likely just the beginning. If such detailed planning had gone into managing Camilla's transition to royal life, what other aspects of the monarchy's operations were being managed behind the scenes? How much of what he believed about his own role and responsibilities was based on authentic tradition versus manufactured necessity? The sun was rising over London when William finally closed his laptop and prepared for bed. In a few hours, he would need to resume his normal royal duties, smiling for cameras and carrying out engagements as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed, and William knew there would be no going back to the comfortable ignorance he had enjoyed just 24 hours earlier. He thought about calling Harry, but the document's dismissive treatment of his brother made him hesitate. How could he explain that their entire adult lives had been shaped by plans they had never been told about? How could he share this burden without destroying Harry's already fragile relationship with their father? For now, William decided he would carry this knowledge alone until he better understood its full implications. But he also knew that secrets this big had a way of demanding action, and eventually he would have to decide what to do with the truth that was now his to bear. 3 weeks had passed since Anne's revelation, and William found himself living a double life. Publicly, he continued his royal duties with practiced efficiency, attending charity events, conducting meetings, and maintaining the warm public persona that had made him one of the most popular royals. Privately, he was conducting the most thorough investigation of his life, using palace resources and trusted contacts to piece together the full story of how his family's recent history had been orchestrated. What he discovered was both more and less than he had feared. The document Anne had shown him was indeed authentic, but it was also incomplete. Through careful inquiries with former palace staff, retired civil servants, and even some journalists who had covered the royal family for decades, William learned that the planning around Camilla's integration into royal life had been even more extensive than the original document suggested. There had been media strategies designed to gradually shift public perception of Camilla from the other woman to devoted companion. There had been charitable initiatives carefully selected to showcase her softer side. There had even been polling data commissioned to test various approaches to introducing her to different segments of the British public. What struck William most forcefully was the clinical precision with which his mother's memory had been managed. Gradually diminished in official contexts, while Camilla's profile was systematically elevated. But William also discovered something else. His father had been far from the mastermind of these arrangements. The planning had been driven primarily by senior palace officials and external advisors who had convinced Charles that such extensive management was necessary to protect the monarchy's stability. Charles had agreed to the plans, certainly, but he had often been as much a managed figure as anyone else involved. This realization complicated William's feelings considerably. His anger at his father remained, but it was now mixed with something approaching sympathy. Charles had been thrust into a role as king-in-waiting that required him to balance personal happiness with institutional stability, and the advisors around him had convinced him that elaborate planning was the only way to achieve both goals successfully. The investigation had taken an emotional toll that William struggled to hide. Catherine noticed his distraction, his tendency to spend long hours in his study, his newfound reluctance to attend events where he might encounter his father and stepmother. When she pressed him about what was troubling him, William found himself in the uncomfortable position of lying to his wife, something he had rarely done in their years together. The breaking point came during a family gathering at Balmoral Castle. The setting was supposed to be relaxed and informal, a chance for the extended royal family to spend time together away from the pressures of official duties. But for William, every interaction with his father and Camilla felt loaded with hidden meaning. Every casual comment seemed to carry the weight of decades of careful planning and manipulation. During a private walk in the castle grounds, Charles asked William if everything was all right. He had noticed his son's distance and wondered if there were problems with William's official duties or personal life that might require assistance. The genuine concern in his father's voice nearly broke William's resolve to handle the situation carefully and methodically. Instead of deflecting as he had planned, William stopped walking and turned to face his father directly. The conversation that followed was unlike any they had ever had. William's questions came quietly but relentlessly. How long had the planning around Camilla been going on? How much of Diana's later years had been managed according to predetermined strategies? How much of William's own role as heir had been scripted by advisors rather than developed naturally? Charles's initial responses were defensive, echoing what he had told Anne weeks earlier about royal protocol and necessary planning. But as William's questions became more specific, revealing knowledge that could only have come from access to confidential documents, Charles realized that his son knew far more than he had initially suspected. The admission, when it came, was painful for both men. Charles acknowledged that yes, there had been extensive planning around managing the transition from Diana to Camilla. Yes, strategies had been developed for handling potential opposition from various quarters, including from his own sons. Yes, some of those strategies had involved managing public perception of Diana's role in ways that, in hindsight, Charles regretted. But Charles also tried to explain the impossible position he had felt himself to be in. As the heir to the throne, he had been told repeatedly that his personal choices could destabilize the entire monarchy. The advisors around him had convinced him that careful management was the only way to protect both the institution and the people he loved. He had never intended for William to be treated as a problem to be managed, rather than a son to be trusted. William listened to his father's explanations with a mixture of understanding and continued anger. The human side of the story made sense to him, a man caught between duty and desire, trying to navigate impossible circumstances with the help of advisors who perhaps cared more about institutional stability than individual happiness. But the institutional side remained troubling. How much of what William believed about his own future role was authentic, and how much was the product of careful planning by people he had never even met? As their conversation continued, both men began to cry. For Charles, it was the relief of finally being able to speak honestly with his son about choices that had haunted him for decades. For William, it was the overwhelming sadness of realizing that so much of what he had believed about his family had been constructed rather than natural. The emotional breakthrough led to practical discussions about how to move forward. William made it clear that he could not simply pretend this conversation had never happened. He needed to understand the full scope of what had been planned, and he needed to be involved in any future decisions that affected his role or his family's future. Charles agreed, promising to provide William with access to whatever documents and information he wanted to review. More importantly, Charles agreed that the era of managing the royal family through elaborate behind-the-scenes planning needed to end. William would be involved as a full partner in any major decisions affecting the monarchy's future direction. The days of treating the heir as someone to be managed rather than consulted were over. The conversation with Camilla came later that same evening and proved to be equally emotional. When Charles explained what had been discussed, Camilla's initial reaction was defensive. She pointed out, never asked for the elaborate planning that had surrounded her entry into royal life. Like Charles, she had often felt more managed than managing, following advice from experts who assured her that careful strategy was necessary for the monarchy's well-being. But as William shared specific details from the documents Anne had shown him, Camilla began to understand the full scope of what had been done in her name. The systematic diminishment of Diana's legacy, the careful positioning of her own public image, the contingency planning that had treated William and Harry as potential obstacles rather than family members. She hadn't known about all of it, but she had known about enough to feel deep guilt about her role in the process. The three-way conversation that followed was perhaps the most honest discussion any of them had ever had about the complex dynamics that had shaped their family for decades. William shared his feelings of betrayal and manipulation. Charles acknowledged his mistakes and his regret about allowing advisors to convince him that such elaborate planning was necessary. Camilla apologized for her role in a process that had caused so much pain, even when she had felt powerless to stop it. By the end of that weekend at Balmoral, the family dynamic had shifted permanently. The relationships between William, Charles, and Camilla were no longer based on careful politeness and managed interactions. Instead, they had become something more honest, but also more fragile. Trust, once broken, would take time and effort to rebuild. William returned to London with a new sense of purpose. He would use his position as heir to ensure that the monarchy operated with greater transparency and authenticity in the future. The days of elaborate behind-the-scenes management were over, but he also understood that the revelations that had changed his understanding of his family would need to be carefully handled to avoid damaging the institution he would someday inherit. The secret that Princess Anne had revealed was no longer destroying the family from within. Instead, it had become the foundation for a new kind of honesty that might ultimately make the monarchy stronger. But the emotional cost of that honesty would be felt by all of them for years to come. As William looked toward his future as king, he knew it would be different from anything his father or grandmother had experienced. The era of managing the monarchy through careful manipulation was ending. What would replace it remained to be written, but it would be written with the full knowledge of what had come before and a determination to do better.